Hey guys, how we doing? I wanted to spend a couple of minutes here talking about the next topic in our story of history here. And I apologize, I'm just recording this with my document camera here because I usually like to, rather than kind of lecture this, I usually like to kind of try and graphic organize our Fed 10. I just feel like it's kind of a better way to go through this document. So it's kind of weird, I realize, because you can't see me talking to you here, but I promise I'm here, hello. And I am going to, kind of try and do this in the way that I would do it in class. So the last time we were together, we talked a little bit about Brutus number 1. And Brutus number 1 is a story of participatory democracy and the problems of the Constitution, right? So the new Constitution that we have is giving more power to the federal government. It's taking power away from the state governments to some degree. And it's basically an argument that participatory democracy is not being fulfilled through that Constitution, right? That there's too many filters, and ultimately the people should have more say in their government. So the connection that you should make from last time is Brutus number 1 connects to participatory democracy. But what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about Federalist number 10. And Federalist number 10 has a connection as well, and it is connected to pluralist theory or pluralism, I guess we could call it. All right, so that's our connection, that's our conversation today. And then I want to try and kind of again, graphic organize what it is exactly that Madison is trying to say in this paper. Because ultimately, again, what he's trying to do is he is trying to make an argument for why the Constitution is appropriate, right? He's a Federalist, so of course that's what they care about. That's what they're trying to convince people, that their system is better. And he recognizes that Brutus 1 makes some really, really solid points. And what he is going to talk about is how groups, though they may have some problems, there may be some criticisms, they are a great means of preventing some bigger problems. In other words, he's almost accepting the fact that participatory democracy is not being totally fulfilled as a means of influencing the government, but instead we are to influence our government through groups. So what I would suggest that you guys do is you get out your Federalist number 10 paper. You can open it up from the foundational document handbook that I gave you, or any other, I think Google probably has a version of it. But open up Fed number 10, and let's kind of start walking through it just a little bit in terms of what it is that Madison has to say. All right? So as we start reading it, the first thing that he does is he explains or he talks a little bit about something that he calls a faction. I guess I could maybe try and, move this around so that you can see here kind of my paper and what exactly he says. But when he talks about a faction, he says, a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse, on the next page here, to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. All right, so he has kind of some negative things to say about factions. Factions, of course, are groups of people. The way that Madison generally describes it is as a mob. All right, and one of the things that Madison is always most fearful of is true democracy. He thinks true democracy is destined to fail, and it's part of the reason that they purposefully did not create a system in our Constitution that is very much participatory democracy, right? He's not necessarily trusting of the general public. As an educated person of the time, he doesn't believe necessarily that the rest of the people have the mental tenacity to wade through our system of government. Okay, so the first thing he does is he talks about a faction. And again, we can use different words to describe the word faction from our context or with our perspective. Political parties are a great way to talk about factions. Interest groups are factions. But factions, again, are groups of people who are united by some sort of a common passion, a common belief or interest. They're tied together. It could be by their occupation, could be by their ideology, but they are tied together in one way or another. And he says, they do potentially represent some problems. All right? And so I think the first thing that we need to do is address how the new Constitution is going to solve what he calls the mischiefs of factions. We don't want mobs ruling our system, which would be big groups of people who band together and then use their numbers to overwhelm people for corrupt purposes, right? We really don't want that. So how are the mischiefs, is the way he calls it, of factions cured? Right, that's what we're trying to solve. Of course, my pen is running out of ink. How are the mischiefs of faction cured? Okay, so if we read along in the paper here, he says there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, and the other is removing, I believe he says controlling, its effects. Okay, so there's two ways to deal with the problem of mobs popping up and doing whatever they want, oppressing a minority population, or in any issue, in anything that we might talk about. How do we prevent that from happening? He says there's really two ways to do it. The first one, removing its causes. So he goes on and talks a little bit about that. He says there are, again, two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, by destroying the liberty, which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. So, while we're on this side, there's two things that we could do to remove the causes of faction. That is, people, again, making the decision to band together for the purpose of furthering their agenda, whatever that might be, and sometimes contrary to what's good for society. The other one, of course, is give everyone the same opinion. Okay, so while we're talking about this side and looking at the two options for removing the causes, right? So people are, making these factions. We think of this as a bad thing, that they want to do what they want to do, sometimes adverse to the rights of other people, that they want to, basically further their cause at whatever cost. And we see this all the time in society. So how do I solve the problem? I can remove its causes. Number one, I could take away our liberty. Right? I could just say, you are not free to do what you want. The government could ultimately deprive you of liberty in the means of preventing factions, right? We could say something like, you're not allowed to assemble. You have no right to assemble in groups. That groups larger than X number of people aren't allowed to meet together, or something like that. You could destroy liberties and freedoms as a means of preventing factions from popping up. The other option says give everyone the same opinion, which is just unrealistic. We talked about how in this country there's plenty of different opinions from one region to the other, and it's impossible, of course, that everyone actually has the same opinion. So this is not possible. So he says, it could never be more truly said than of the first remedy, that it's worse than the disease. In other words, these remedies are worse than the disease, which is the factions. It says, liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. And he's basically making probably the most famous point in the paper here. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire. In other words, if we are going to be a free society where we give people liberties and freedoms, liberties to join together in groups, then of course there is going to be faction, because liberty and freedom causes factions to pop up, the same, that we make a connection between air and fire. And he says, you wouldn't, in an effort to prevent fire from breaking out, destroy air. You wouldn't, take away air as a means of preventing fire, because that sort of creates a problem when it comes to, survival. And he says it's the same thing here. When you're talking about factions, you wouldn't take away liberty in an effort to prevent factions from popping up, because liberty is more important. So that takes us to the other side here, which is we're going to be looking at controlling its